Jacob Trouba being retraded. I mean, you know what? A hot take, and this would be so funny, is if the Ducks retained 50% and got a great return from the New Jersey Devils. Again, there's a conversation behind the scenes that Trouba needs to be close to the state of New York for his partner's career. That's been a conversation. And if that's the case, I mean, you can't get much closer than Jersey. So if the New Jersey Devils came calling, I mean, a Brendan Dillon, Jacob Trouba, third pair would probably be the most physical, just big hit pair in the league. So I would keep an eye on the Devils here. Beyond that, in terms of teams that are closer to New York-ish, I mean, the Boston Bruins could make some sense here. Again, it would have to be heavy retention. Maybe it's a scenario where if they haven't loved how Zadorov's played, and there's been some rumors around that, you send Nikita Zadorov to Anaheim, and you get Trouba knowing he's only got 2 years left on his contract, and you get out of the Zadorov contract. Because that Zadorov contract is heavy. It's a big commitment. Does Boston want to keep that commitment? Dylan Cozens with the Buffalo Sabres. This is as easy as possible to just state that Dylan Cozens to the Vancouver Canucks makes so much sense. If there was a trade for Elias Pettersson, you can guarantee that Dylan Cozens will be going the other way. So, I mean, technically in terms of hometown, I think, and I believe Cozens is from the Yukon, so Vancouver would be technically his hometown for the most part. So I think Dylan Cozens going to the Canucks would make a lot of sense. If I had to throw another team in the mix, it'd probably be Colorado just because they traded for Middlestat and they want that center depth. I feel like Buffalo would really love a Ross Colton. I'm not saying it makes a lot of sense in terms of the cap, but I think Vancouver probably makes a lot of sense. If I had to throw in a third team, it would be back to that Calgary Flames conversation. I really, really think the Buffalo Sabres have looked at both Rasmus Anderson and Nazem Kadri. And if that's the case, I'm sure Calgary will look at both Dylan Cozens and Bowen Byram. John Gibson, Pittsburgh Penguins, Pittsburgh Penguins, Pittsburgh Penguins. I've said this for too long. Anaheim, you can get assets from Pittsburgh for taking on that Tristan Jarry contract and giving Pittsburgh native John Gibson. John Gibson was born in Pittsburgh, or at least his profile says he's from Pittsburgh. John Gibson to Pittsburgh makes too much sense. You have Sidney Crosby still. You have Evgeny Malkin. You have Erik Karlsson. You have Chris Letang. You need a goalie. If you get to the show, we always talk about getting to the show, getting to the playoffs. When I say show, I'm talking playoffs. What will happen if you get to the show? What will happen if you get to the playoffs? Well, you need those key points. You need the physicality in the matchup game to really withstand the playoff hockey. You need to have a good defense group. And you need to have a hot goalie. And John Gibson can be that. As much as people are going to say he's washed and certain conversations like that, he is a guy that can do that. Number 7, Taylor Hall. You know what? This one's interesting for me because I actually don't even know if he would get a lot in terms of a return. But I feel like Taylor Hall, 50% retained at $3 million. I feel like if I'm a team's general manager, I'm all over that. I'm remembering what Taylor Hall did in his MVP season with the New Jersey Devils. I'm remembering what he's done with the Boston Bruins, with the Edmonton Oilers at times. Again, has it worked out necessarily in terms of playoff success? No, but I think Taylor Hall at $3 million would bring a lot of value. So Chicago's willing to retain for a pending UFA and Taylor Hall. I think a lot of teams should be in after him. I would look at anywhere from the Washington Capitals. I would look at a team like the Tampa Bay Lightning. Again, I'm looking at the Lightning. They're going to be an interesting team. They're right there in the mix in the wild card. They know they're not done. They brought in Jake Gensel. I mean, I'm with you on the whole Stamkos thing and the treatment and all that. But if you bring in a Taylor Hall, or another name I'll bring up is a Jason Zucker. I look at two guys like that, and if those two teams, Buffalo and Chicago, are willing to retain, those would be guys that you can throw on your second or third line in Tampa and make the world of a difference. And they have that Connor Sheary contract buried. Like, he would probably go the other way to shave off some dollars and make it work on Tampa's salary cap. But, I mean, Taylor Hall just makes so much sense. And again, I keep forgetting this, and people forget, is after the Sergachev trade, when Tampa traded Sergachev to Utah, that opened up cap space for Tampa. So keep an eye on that as well. They have more flexibility going into this deadline than they have in past, kind of, because, again, they had the whole Nikita Kucherov LTIR situation, which gave them different kinds of flexibility. Chris Kreider from the New York Rangers. This one's tough, man. To see Kreider get traded from the Rangers is going to be a weird one if it happens. You know what's funny? I actually think Kreider would be a perfect fit for one of the Florida teams. They play that style. Kreider plays that style. I think one of the Florida teams makes a lot of sense. But if the Rangers are looking for moving this guy out of the conference, one team I would look at truly is the Vegas Golden Knights. And I think there's a couple guys that the Rangers could take back in that trade. But I would definitely look at the Vegas Golden Knights. I think that makes a lot of sense. And again, if they're not trading out of conference, I'm sure the Boston Bruins are going to inquire. But the Vegas Golden Knights makes a lot of sense to me. And again, keep an eye on the fact that the Rangers and Canucks, I'm going to keep going back to it, are talking a lot. So if there's a scenario where Kreider is in those conversations and he's willing to go to Vancouver, then maybe he's included. Now we're to the top 5, Brandon Saad. So I've already referenced Saad to a couple different teams, including the Rangers and Penguins. I think both teams make sense here. The Penguins and Blues have made a couple moves together. I could see Saad fitting in the Penguins' middle 6. They have a couple guys that could make some sense being flipped back to St. Louis, like on the Pittsburgh side. Why I say the Rangers is a couple reasons. It seems like the Rangers don't want to move on from Vinny Trocheck. That's not going to happen. So if that's the case, Brandon Saad and Trocheck were teammates prior to the NHL. I think if there was a scenario where one of two things, the Rangers and Blues get into trade conversations, maybe the Rangers are going, hey, we want to revisit bringing Pavel Buchnevich back. Oh, St. Louis Kings up. Call him again and go, hey, how about Brandon Saad? I heard you guys want to trade Saad. He had a hat trick recently. I think his value is still not as high as they'd like, but maybe that's a benefit for the Rangers who are really trying to shake things up and switch things up in the locker room. And I feel like there's that word called chemistry that the Rangers don't have right now. So if you're talking about Brandon Saad and Trocheck being guys that know each other, whether they're pals or not, I'm not sure, but they were teammates prior to the NHL. I think it could make some sense. And then, yeah, the combination here from Lyle, JT Miller and Elias Pettersson. You could probably, I don't want to be at the point to say one of them's for sure getting moved this season, but in terms of career Vancouver Canucks, I think we can be pretty confident to say these two guys individually are not going to both finish their careers with the Canucks, unless JT Miller decides to hang it up early on here, but I don't think that's the case. So I'm pretty confident that one of them will get moved, but the fact that both will get moved is crazy. For JT Miller, you can go in so many different directions. You could go from the New York Rangers. You could go both Pettersson and Miller to the Buffalo Sabres if that was the trade that went down. Another one I would look at just in terms of, I believe he was born or from Ohio. I would look at the Columbus Blue Jackets because they're in a wild card spot right now. And JT Miller, I feel like would fit really well with the Jackets. A 1-2 punch with Sean Monahan. And 1-2-3 punch with Adam Fantilli. Again, I don't think the Blue Jackets are trading Fantilli, but I'm sure Vancouver would ask about him. And then Pettersson, beyond the Buffalo Sabres and Rangers, I would probably look at the Detroit Red Wings. They love their Swedish players. It makes a lot of sense. And they've got pieces they can send back to Vancouver. So keep an eye on those two teams. But overall, those three are the ones to mention, I think. And the final two, Ivan Provorov. This one's interesting for me. If I'm Columbus, I at least inquire on what an extension would look like. But after that long-term David Severson contract, if I'm Columbus, I don't make the same mistake in signing Provorov long-term. But it's easy to look at recency bias here, and Provorov and Werenski have played really well together, and they've been, I would say, one of the best duos on defense in the last few weeks. So, you know what? Provorov, for me, really good top 4 defenseman. I think if you're Columbus, though, and you're on the outskirts of a wildcard spot and you get offered a first-round pick for this guy, you should say yes without a doubt. But if you're in the playoff race, you probably keep him and you probably inquire about a long-term extension. And Brock Nelson. So Jason Zucker wasn't really in this conversation, but I think he's my honorable mention. So again, keep an eye on a team like Tampa or the Florida teams. If Buffalo's trading him outside of the division, look at a team like the Winnipeg Jets. I could see Alex Iafallo going back to the Buffalo Sabres. Brock Nelson, you know what? There's probably 15 teams I could connect Brock Nelson to. The Minnesota Wild by far make the most sense. If they don't go after a guy like Sam Bennett or some of the other centers I outlined, and you could also mention Jean-Gabriel Pageau on the Islanders, where I think teams like Wilds or Toronto will look at. Specifically, Brock Nelson, the Wild make too much sense here. Again, I always love referencing the hometowns. Well, Minnesota is his hometown. It's his home state. And I think at the end of the day, they've needed a guy like this for a while. Driving offense. He's a guy that consistently scores 20 plus goals every year. It can be higher than that. It ain't going to be lower. Playoff performer too. He's seen a couple conference final runs. The Wild have not in recent memory. I think when you look at Brock Nelson, I wonder if they'd be willing to trade Marco Rossi if it meant a Brock Nelson extension. I don't think they're doing that, though. So I would look at the other guys I've talked about, whether it's a Ryan Hartman or a Frederick Gaudreau makes sense in terms of the cap going back to the Islanders. And then the Wild, they've already traded their first-round pick for Juracek from Columbus. So if they have to go into 2026 draft pot to trade another first-round pick, that would be tough. But maybe it's a couple prospects and a couple second-round picks. It might make sense. If they're not getting a guaranteed extension, I think the Islanders realize that they might lose them for nothing. So 2 seconds, a couple good Wild prospects, it could end up being a scenario. So thank you so much for going through this. Guys, again, I'm getting really into the feel of these weekly streams, and I'm